The grand piano sat in the corner of the ballroom, its polished surface gleaming under the glow of the chandeliers. The party was in full swing, with the city's elite swirling about in tailored suits and glittering gowns. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed through the vast hall, but for me, the noise barely registered. My attention was fixed on the empty seat in front of the piano. I didn't even know why I'd agreed to host this event. Ever since Claire disappeared 20 years ago, I'd withdrawn from this world. The parties, the wealth, the performances, they all felt hollow without her. But tonight, I'd allowed myself to be coaxed out of isolation. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe I just missed hearing music that didn't make my heart ache. "Mr. Bennett," a voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see a young woman standing beside me, her gaze hesitant. She was one of the performers for the evening, a last-minute replacement for the original pianist who had fallen ill. She looked so small standing there, clutching a portfolio of sheet music to her chest. Her name was Eve, if I remembered correctly. "The piano's ready," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the din of the room. "Should I start?" I nodded, gesturing toward the stage. "Go ahead." She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the piano. "Do you have any requests?" The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I considered brushing her off, telling her to play whatever she wanted. But instead, I found myself saying, "Play something meaningful." Her brow furrowed slightly, as if she were trying to read between the lines of my vague instruction. Then she nodded and walked to the piano, her gown trailing behind her like liquid silver. The room fell silent as she sat down and placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers hovered there for a moment, as if she were gathering her thoughts, or perhaps her courage. And then she began to play. The first few notes sent a shockwave through me, freezing me in place. It was a melody I hadn't heard in 2 decades, one I thought I'd never hear again. Claire's melody. 20 years ago, Claire had written that piece herself, spending countless hours at the piano in our old house, perfecting every note. She'd called it Eternal Breeze, a name that had seemed romantic and whimsical at the time. I could still picture her sitting at the piano, her long hair falling over her shoulders as she played, her eyes closed, completely lost in the music. It was the piece she'd been working on the night she disappeared. The night everything changed. The memories came rushing back with a force I couldn't control. It had been a summer evening, the air warm and sweet with the scent of jasmine. Claire had been practicing in the music room while I worked late in my study. I remembered hearing her laughter as I passed by, the way she called out to me, "Come listen to this part. I think I've finally got it." But I didn't stop. I told her I'd listen later, once I finished my work. I never got the chance. She was gone the next morning. No note, no explanation. Just an empty house and an empty heart. The police had their theories, of course a lover, an escape, maybe even an accident. But nothing ever added up. I'd searched for her for years, pouring money into private investigators and following every lead, no matter how flimsy. But eventually, the trail went cold. All I had left was her music. And now, 20 years later, that same melody was filling the room, each note cutting through me like glass. Eve's performance was flawless, her fingers moving across the keys with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. It wasn't just the notes she was playing, it was the way she played them, as if she knew the story behind the music. As the final chord faded, the room erupted into applause. But I barely noticed. My mind was spinning, my heart pounding in my chest. How did she know the piece? I approached her as she stood and gave a polite bow to the audience. She turned toward me, her expression unreadable. "Where did you learn that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. She looked taken aback, but didn't flinch. "The piece?" she asked. "Yes," I said, stepping closer. "That melody, it's not something you just find in a book. Where did you hear it?" Her lips parted as if to speak, but for a moment she hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, "I've known it my whole life." Her answer made no sense. Claire had written that melody. She'd created it from scratch, pouring her heart into every note. No one else could have known it. "What do you mean, your whole life?" I pressed. Eve glanced down, her hands clutching the edges of her gown. I don't know how to explain it, she said. I've just always known it. It's like it's been with me forever. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling. Eve's eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something there, something familiar. I don't know, she said. I couldn't sleep that night. The memory of the melody haunted me, intertwining with Eve's cryptic words. She'd said she'd known it her whole life. But how was that possible? There had to be an explanation, I told myself. A logical one, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The only person who could answer my questions was Claire. But Claire was gone. Or was she? The days that followed felt like a waking dream, or perhaps a nightmare. My mind was consumed by Eve's performance, the melody that had disappeared from my life 2 decades ago, only to resurface in the hands of a stranger. Eve's words lingered, gnawing at me. I've known it my whole life. It wasn't possible. Claire had written that piece. Every note, every measure was hers. It was as unique as her smile, as irreplaceable as her presence. And yet, here was Eve, playing it with a familiarity that defied logic. I couldn't let it go. On the 3rd day after the party, I decided to find Eve. I'd gotten her information from the event coordinator, a cell phone number, and a vague address on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was enough. When she answered the phone, her voice was cautious. Hello. It's Bennett, I said. We met at the party the other night. A pause. Yes. How can I help you? I need to see you, I said, my voice firm. There are questions I need answered. Another pause. Then, reluctantly, she said, okay, come by this evening. I'll text you the address. Her home was modest, a small cottage tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. It was a far cry from the lavish world of grand pianos and glittering ballrooms. Eve answered the door in a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She looked younger than she had at the party, almost vulnerable. Thank you for meeting me, I said as I stepped inside. She nodded, leading me to a cozy living room. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a well-loved piano sat in the corner, its surface worn from years of use. What's this about? She asked, sitting across from me. I hesitated, unsure how to begin. That piece you played, I said finally. It's not just a song. It's a melody my wife wrote before she disappeared. No one else knew it. Eve's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look surprised, just conflicted. I told you, she said softly. I've always known it. I don't know how or why, but it's been with me for as long as I can remember. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Where are you from? I asked, leaning forward. Eve looked down at her hands. I don't know exactly, she admitted. I was adopted as a baby. My parents never told me much about where I came from. Adopted. The word hung heavy in the air, sparking a dozen thoughts in my mind. Do you know anything about your biological parents? I asked, my voice tightening. She shook her head. No, just that I was found near a beach when I was an infant. They said I was wrapped in a blanket, left near the shore. My heart stopped. A beach? Yes, she said. Why? I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. Claire's disappearance had been sudden and unexplained, but there had always been one detail that haunted me. Her car had been found near a coastal road. The police had combed the area, searching the cliffs and the water below, but there was no sign of her. What if she'd gone into the ocean? What if... No, it couldn't be. Eve must have seen the turmoil on my face, because she leaned forward, her expression softening. Mr. Bennett, are you okay? I don't know, I admitted, my voice cracking. This is all too much. Eve hesitated before speaking again. Do you think your wife, could she be connected to me somehow? I don't know, I said, but I intend to find out. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts raced, spinning wild theories that bordered on the impossible. Could Claire have somehow survived? Could she have left a piece of herself behind, hidden in this young woman who had appeared out of nowhere? The idea was absurd, and yet the melody connected them in a way that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, I called a private investigator I'd worked with years ago during my search for Claire. His name was Marcus, and though we hadn't spoken in over a decade, he picked up on the first ring. Bennett, he said, his voice gruff. It's been a long time. I need your help, I said without preamble. There's a young woman I need you to look into. She's connected to Claire. There was a pause on the other end. Claire, he repeated. I thought you'd given up on that. So did I admitted. But something's changed. I'll send you the details. The next few days were agonizing. I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Eve. What if she really was connected to Claire? What if she held the key to understanding what had happened all those years ago? When Marcus finally called back, I answered on the first ring. I found something, he said. What is it? I asked, my heart pounding. Her adoption records, he said. They're unusual. What do you mean? There's no official record of her birth, Marcus said. No hospital records, no birth certificate, nothing. It's like she appeared out of thin air. I sank into my chair, my mind reeling. Is there anything else? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus hesitated. The beach where she was found, it's the same area where Claire's car was discovered. My blood ran cold. Bennett, Marcus said, his tone grave. I don't know what this means, but whatever you're chasing, be careful. I hung up the phone, staring blankly at the wall. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was one I couldn't understand, one I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. Eve wasn't just a stranger who happened to know Claire's melody. She was tied to her in a way I couldn't explain, a way that defied logic. And I was going to find out how. The realization gnawed at me relentlessly. The connection between Eve and Claire wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The melody, the beach, the missing records, it all pointed to something bigger, something I wasn't sure I was prepared to face. But I couldn't stop now. Not when I was so close to answers. The next day, I called Eve and asked to meet her again. She sounded hesitant, but agreed to meet me at a nearby cafe. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a corner table, a cup of tea in front of her. She looked nervous, her fingers tapping lightly against the side of the mug. Thank you for coming, I said, taking a seat across from her. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the table. You said you wanted to talk about my adoption? Yes, I said, leaning forward. I've been looking into your past. I hope that's okay. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look angry, just surprised. I found out that your records are incomplete, I continued. No birth certificate, no hospital records. Nothing. And the beach where you were found, it's the same place where my wife disappeared. Eve's breath hitched, and she finally looked up at me, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. What are you saying? I'm not sure yet, I admitted. But there's something connecting you to Claire. I don't know how, but I think she's a part of you. Eve sat back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. This is insane, she whispered. You're saying I'm what? Some kind of reincarnation of your wife. No, I said quickly. I don't know what I'm saying. All I know is that the melody you played, it's something only Claire knew. And the fact that you were found so close to where she disappeared, it can't be a coincidence. She shook her head, her expression torn. I don't remember anything about where I came from. My parents always told me I was abandoned, and I never asked questions. But I've always felt like something was missing. Her words struck a chord deep within me. I remembered Claire once saying something similar, years before she disappeared. She'd always had a restless energy, a sense of longing for something she couldn't quite name. Do you have anything from when you were found? I asked. Anything that might help us figure this out? Eve hesitated, then nodded slowly. There's a box, she said. My adoptive parents kept it. They said it was all they had when they found me. Can you show it to me? I asked, trying to keep the urgency out of my voice. She looked unsure, but eventually nodded. Okay, let's go. Eve's home was quiet and unassuming, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside me. She led me to a small closet in the hallway and pulled out an old wooden box. It was weathered, its edges worn smooth by time. This is it, she said, setting it on the table. I opened the box carefully, my hands trembling. Inside was a faded blanket, a small silver locket, and a piece of sheet music folded neatly in a corner. The sight of the sheet music made my heart stop. I unfolded it slowly, my breath catching as I recognized the notes. It was Claire's handwriting, her signature scrawled at the bottom of the page. This is her melody, I whispered, my voice shaking. This is Claire's. Eve leaned over, her eyes wide as she stared at the paper. How is that possible? I don't know, I said, tears pricking my eyes. But this proves it. You're connected to her. Somehow, you're connected to her. The locket caught my eye next. I picked it up and opened it, revealing a tiny photograph inside. It was Claire, smiling brightly, her hair blowing in the wind. This was hers too, I said, my voice breaking. Eve stared at the locket, her expression unreadable. I've seen her, she said quietly. I froze. What? In my dreams, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've seen her face. I didn't know who she was, but she always felt familiar. A chill ran down my spine. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the box, the music, and what Eve had said about her dreams. Everything was pointing to a connection between her and Claire, but the pieces weren't fitting together. If Claire had disappeared into the ocean, how could parts of her have ended up with Eve? I needed more answers, and there was only one place left to look. The following morning, I drove out to the beach where Claire's car had been found. The place was eerily quiet, the waves lapping gently against the shore. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the horizon, hoping for some kind of clarity. As I walked along the sand, I noticed something glinting in the sunlight. It was small and metallic, half buried in the sand. I bent down and picked it up, brushing away the grains to reveal a bracelet. It was Claire's bracelet. I remembered it vividly. The delicate silver chain, the tiny charm shaped like a seashell. She'd worn it every day. But how was it here, 20 years later? As I stood there, holding the bracelet in my hand, I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was as if the air around me had changed, growing heavier and colder. And then I heard it, a melody, faint and haunting, carried on the wind. Claire's melody. I turned toward the water, my heart pounding. The waves seemed to shimmer, the sunlight reflecting off them in an almost hypnotic way. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the surf, a woman with long hair, her face turned toward me. Claire, I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, and when I blinked, it was gone. But the melody lingered, echoing in my mind. I knew then that I couldn't stop. Whatever the truth was, no matter how impossible or strange, I had to uncover it. Eve was the key, and the ocean still held the answers. The bracelet sat heavy in my pocket as I drove back to Eve's house. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, a truth that had been waiting for me beneath the surface for 20 long years. The connection between Claire, Eve, and the ocean had to mean something, but every piece of evidence I uncovered only deepened the mystery. Claire's melody, Eve's dreams, the bracelet appearing on that beach after all these years. It all pointed to the impossible. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. When I arrived, Eve opened the door before I could knock. She must have seen the urgency in my face because she stepped aside without a word, letting me in. I found this, I said, pulling the bracelet from my pocket and holding it out to her. Eve's eyes widened as she took it from me. This was hers? I nodded. She wore it every day. I don't know how, but I found it on the beach where her car was discovered. It doesn't make sense. It's been 20 years. Eve turned the bracelet over in her hands, her expression thoughtful. It's beautiful, she said softly. I feel like I've seen it before. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Eve, I said, my voice steady. I need to ask you something. I need you to be honest with me. She looked up at me, her gaze steady. Okay, do you remember anything at all, from before you were adopted? Even fragments, dreams, feelings? Eve hesitated, her brow furrowing as she considered my question. I don't know, she said finally. I've always had this feeling like the ocean is a part of me. Whenever I'm near the water, it feels familiar, like I belong there. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I sat down across from her, trying to piece together the fragments of what I'd uncovered. Eve, when Claire disappeared, the police found her car near the cliffs by the ocean. They searched for weeks, but never found a trace of her. I've always believed she went into the water, but now, I'm starting to wonder if she left something behind. What do you mean? she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. What if you're connected to her in a way we can't explain? What if part of her is in you? Eve stared at me, her expression torn between disbelief and something deeper. Recognition, maybe. That doesn't make sense, she said, shaking her head. I know, I admitted, but none of this makes sense. And yet, here we are. The next morning, I convinced Eve to come with me to the beach. She was hesitant at first, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes, the pull of something she couldn't quite name. The drive was quiet, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, the air was crisp and cool, the waves rolling gently against the shore. This is where it all began, I said, gesturing toward the water. This is where Claire's car was found. And this is where you were found, wrapped in a blanket, just a baby. Eve stepped closer to the water, her arms wrapped around herself as she gazed out at the horizon. It feels familiar, she said quietly, like I've been here before. As we stood there, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of salt and something else, something earthy, almost metallic. And then I heard it again, the melody. It was faint, carried on the wind like a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Do you hear that? I asked, my voice trembling. Eve nodded, her eyes wide. Yes, she said. It's the same melody I've always known. The sound grew louder, more distinct, as if the ocean itself were playing the notes. Eve took a step forward, her feet sinking into the wet sand. It's calling me, she said, her voice distant. Eve, wait, I said, grabbing her arm. You don't have to go. She turned to me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. I do, she said. I need to know. I need to understand. Before I could stop her, she stepped into the water. Eve, I shouted, running after her. But she didn't stop. The waves lapped at her ankles, then her knees, then her waist. Eve, come back, I screamed, my heart pounding in my chest. She turned to look at me one last time, her expression calm. Trust me, she said, and then she disappeared beneath the surface. I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where she'd gone under. The ocean was still, eerily calm, as if it were holding its breath. Minutes passed, then an hour, and there was no sign of her. But just as the sun began to set, the water rippled, and Eve emerged. She walked out of the ocean slowly, her hair dripping and her clothes clinging to her skin. But something about her was different. Her eyes were brighter, her posture more confident. And in her hands, she held something small and metallic, a locket. It's hers, she said, holding it out to me. I took it from her, my hands shaking. When I opened it, I saw the same photograph of Claire, smiling brightly. But beneath it, there was a folded piece of paper. I pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. It was a handwritten note, the ink slightly smudged but still legible. It read, "If you're reading this, it means I've found a way to come back. I'm sorry I had to leave, but the ocean called me, and I couldn't ignore it. Take care of her. She's the best of me." Tears streamed down my face as I read the note, the truth finally settling in. Claire had left something behind, something more profound than I could have imagined. Eve wasn't just a stranger. She was Claire's legacy, her connection to the world she'd been forced to leave behind. As I looked at Eve, I saw her for what she truly was, a bridge between two worlds, a living melody that Claire had left to guide me back to her. Eve stood before me, her hair dripping and her face calm, as if she had emerged from a dream instead of the ocean. The locket was still warm in my hand, its delicate weight an anchor to everything I had just realized. Claire's words, "Take care of her. She's the best of me," reverberated through my mind. I looked at Eve, and for the first time, I saw her clearly. She wasn't just someone who knew Claire's melody. She was the melody, a piece of Claire brought to life in a way I could barely comprehend. "Are you okay?" I asked her, my voice trembling. She nodded, her expression soft but tired. "I understand now," she said. "Understand what?" I asked, stepping closer. Eve's gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the sun was sinking into the water, casting the ocean in hues of gold and crimson. "Why I've always felt drawn to this place. Why the melody has always been with me." She turned back to me, her eyes brighter than I'd ever seen them. She gave me a part of herself? Didn't she? Yes, I said, my throat tight with emotion. I think she did. The drive back to Eve's house was quiet, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us. I couldn't stop glancing at her, marveling at how she had changed in just a few hours. There was a sense of peace about her now, as if she'd found the answer she had been searching for her entire life. When we arrived, Eve went straight to the piano. She sat down, her fingers hovering over the keys for a moment before she began to play. It was the same melody, Claire's melody, but there was something new in it now. It was fuller, richer, infused with a warmth that hadn't been there before. I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me. It felt like Claire was in the room with us, her presence woven into every note. When Eve finished, she looked up at me, her expression soft. "What happens now?" she asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. What had happened now? Claire had given Eve her melody, her essence, but that didn't erase the pain of her absence or the 20 years I had spent searching for answers. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think we're meant to figure it out together." Eve smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her face. Over the next few weeks, Eve and I worked to piece together the fragments of her past. With the help of Marcus, the private investigator, we tracked down the family who had found her as a baby. Their story was as strange as it was haunting. They had been walking along the beach one morning when they discovered her, wrapped in a blanket and tucked into the hollow of a rock. She hadn't been crying, just staring at the ocean with wide, unblinking eyes. They had assumed she was abandoned, a child left behind by desperate parents. But now, knowing what I knew, it seemed more likely that the ocean itself had delivered her to them. Eve and I returned to the beach one last time, not to search for answers, but to say goodbye. We stood together at the water's edge, the waves lapping gently at our feet. "She's still out there," Eve said, her voice steady. "I can feel her." I nodded. "So can I." The ocean stretched out before us, vast and eternal, its surface shimmering in the sunlight. It wasn't just a body of water. It was a living, breathing force that had connected us in ways I couldn't fully understand. Eve reached in her pocket and pulled out the locket. She opened it one last time, gazing at the photo of Claire before closing it and tossing it into the waves. "Goodbye," she whispered. The locket disappeared beneath the water, swallowed by the sea. As we walked back to the car, I felt a strange sense of closure. Claire was gone, but she wasn't lost. She had left a piece of herself behind, a living reminder of her love and her music. And as long as Eve was here, playing that melody, Claire would never truly be gone.